Are we on? Great.
Yeah.
Hello. Welcome to Tisky Sour. We have survived the Tory leadership debate.
Barely.
And I'm joined by a much better panel than Emily Maitlis had, I think. I've got James Meadway, fresh from John McDonnell's office. Well, kind of fresh. It's been a couple of months now, hasn't it?
Yeah.
You make it sound like he was being held captive there.
Yeah, or the, I'm like some of you found in the fridge.
Did he treat you well?
A while ago. Did he treat me well? Of course he treats you. Of course he treats me well.
Did he feed you regularly?
Should we move on?
Ash.
Hi.
Are you fed regularly?
Not by you.
Not by John McDonnell.
That would be weird anyway, wouldn't it? And Ash Sarkar, senior editor at Novara Media. How did you find the debate? Suitably infused?
Didn't learn anything new about anyone. I think that also it was a really bad debate for being able to apply pressure to the panellists. The lack of a studio audience, I think, meant that they treated it more as an internal squabble. Boris Johnson in particular just blustered over Emily Maitlis when she pressed him on things and made interventions. And I think the thing of having voters pop up on a screen was, good for that sense of there's a public out there, but bad for getting the panellists to stick to the questions with any great amount of rigour. So, not very good.
I thought the biggest surprise of the night was Boris Johnson getting out the BAME card. So he was asked about Islamophobia, and he said that his great-granddad, who was Muslim, would be proud and surprised that he'd become Foreign Secretary.
And he thought that it would be something for Britain to be proud of. That's the thing, is that we often say there's no such thing as a race card, but there's one race card in existence, and Boris Johnson had it.
It's the Muslim great-granddad race card.
Yeah.
Right?
That's
okay, I think I couldn't. It would be a stretch.
It's not actually a race card.
Oh, I see. Sorry.
White,
okay,
so that's why
I'll
he's
try
allowed
not
to
to.
use
I'll try
it.
not
Yeah.
to play that one.
James, what did you think?
I thought it was terrible.
Who came out
I thought it was
best?
absolutely awful. I agree with Ashley. The format was ridiculous. I mean, this might be I've suddenly had the bad thought, although it's almost certainly true. This is why Boris Johnson agreed to do this debate in this format, because, of course, there was no real pressure applied to him at any point, or any of the candidates. He was just sort of vaguely talking over each other around points they were trying to make at some points. There were a couple of moments where you thought maybe some of the candidates were having a little bit of a pop at each other, but it's a very internal thing. I thought Sajid Javid having a go at Rory Stewart on the issue of Islamophobia and Donald Trump in particular was a bit more of a slight moment of tension. But the problem at this point is that, look, we're not really the audience, right? The audience they claim 160,000 members. It's obviously not 160,000 actually functioning members. Bear in mind the Tory Party is now an organisation which is funded more by its dead members than by its actual living people paying subs to it. So let's treat those figures with a pinch of salt and see what they actually finally declare as the turnout and who voted by the end of it.
Was it that G.K. Chesterton said the Tory tradition is a democracy of the dead, and I never expected them to take it quite so literally.
Well, there we go. It's very good. And that's exactly what we're up against. So we're not the audience. So you can drag in members of the public from various parts of the country as well, and probably introduce things that maybe some Tory members wouldn't throw in. I thought the question about Islamophobia was worth asking of the Tory party, because it's one of the things they really don't want to talk about. It changes it a little bit, but the format's bad. We're not the audience. There's a slight feeling of like, okay, this person's going to be Prime Minister, so we probably ought to have a little bit of a public scrutiny. But if you're going to have a public scrutiny, you ought to have a public vote. And as they all made very clear, because they're cowards and anti-democratic cowards at that, they all made very clear there is no chance, under any circumstances, that they will be calling a general election anytime soon. Every single one of them made that very clear, because they know their audience. They know their first audience is Tory MPs, and there is no way Tory MPs want a general election anytime soon for all the bluster about how much they want to take on Jeremy Corbyn. Not going to happen. And they don't really want to force their members to go through another general election either.
So the difficulty is, so with these debates, as they keep occurring, I think what many people in the audience are wanting is someone to push them on sort of the irresponsibility or the recklessness of pushing for a no-deal Brexit. But then we can't forget the fact who is voting in these elections. So YouGov had some good stats out this morning, which I think we can probably get up, Gary. So it's the one that says Tory members are swivel-eyed loons. That's the caption I've given it. That's because that was what a David Cameron advisor, one of his top advisors, had called the members.
Yeah, you're not just being insulting.
It's not my words. I would never use that to describe them. So maybe we can get those up. So Tories are so committed to Brexit. This is the membership that they would prefer Brexit to Scotland No, they prefer Scotland to leave the EU than to not have Brexit by 63 to 29.
They easily prefer Brexit to Scotland, by the way. I think that's probably take that as read.
Well, they easily prefer Brexit to the economy as well. So significant damage to the UK economy. 61% would prefer Brexit, or would rather Brexit took place even if it caused significant damage to the UK economy. 59% would rather Northern Ireland left the United Kingdom if it were required to allow Brexit to take place. And this is the interesting one, actually. 54% would be willing to accept the Conservative Party being destroyed if it was the only thing that would allow Brexit to take place. I suppose that's because a lot of them are thinking, we'll just jump over to the Brexit Party, that will be completely fine. The only thing that Tory party members fear more than Brexit being cancelled is Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister. So 51% of them would block Brexit if that was the only way to keep Jeremy Corbyn out of Downing Street.
I mean, I've got some half-baked hot takes on this.
That's what we like on Novara Media.
The best kind of hot take. I mean, I think first is that...
The cookie dough of hot takes.
The cookie dough, the sort of like squidgy...
Delicious, squidgy, semi-hot takes.
will make you feel a bit nauseous. Like, won't agree with you.
Somewhat insightful, but not intimidatingly so.
That used to be my Tinder bio. So basically, I think what this paints a picture of is baby boomer nihilism, and it's a sort of worldview which I think is, because often when we've spoken about Brexit and we've talked about the sort of importance of political values over a sort of technocratic approach to managing the economy, we've had this sort of emphasis on who's been most affected by austerity. One of the things that we haven't tried to get our heads around or to understand with any great deal of depth is the sort of baby boomer nihilism of people who have done very well for themselves, who do own property, maybe even own more than one, who've got very good pensions, and just also really hate the idea of anyone telling them what to do. And it's not particularly deep how I'm saying it, but I think it's something that we need to get our heads around if we're going to think about how Labour responds to the crisis presented by Brexit, which is a political crisis, but also I think at a more fundamental level it's a social crisis. It's a crisis of how we relate to one another and how we think of ourselves in collective terms. The interesting thing is when you put Jeremy Corbyn up amongst all those things, that the idea of Britain is not important to Conservative Party members. I think the implicit thing there, it's not something which came up in the data in explicit terms. The implicit thing is that the idea of Englishness is much more important. So English nationalism, not British nationalism. Perhaps Britain was always a sort of substitute vehicle for Englishness anyway. And then when you put Jeremy Corbyn up against that, he's the sort of, even though he's particularly English in some ways, he likes manhole covers and allotments, he's antithetical to ideas of aggressive and bellicose and kind of gouty English nationalism. He's also seen as being suspiciously close to their Muslims, you know, the Iranians, the jihadis, brown people in Peterborough, all the rest of it. And so there is nothing that most Conservative Party members loathe more than the spectre of brown people, or the spectre of a prime minister who's perceived to be close to brown people as well. I think that's the sort of hidden story undergirding that data.
I think you could almost see those poll results in the debate, because obviously Michael Gove, I think a couple of weeks ago, said that if we need to delay Brexit, we'll delay Brexit. It's somewhat arbitrary to say we have to leave on the 31st of October. If we can leave in mid-November or in January on a better deal, let's go and do that. But then I think he's seen, you know, these results and said that's potentially not very popular with the Tory grassroots, and he's decided the only way he can make up for this is to constantly call Jeremy Corbyn a Marxist. So you often have in these debates, it was the same on Sunday, whatever the question, Michael Gove manages to come up with a very incongruous response, which is about how Jeremy Corbyn is a Marxist who's going to turn Britain into Venezuela.
Oh, no, it was something about, wasn't it tax cuts? It was something about tax cuts or austerity, and it was like, you know who doesn't care about working people? Jeremy Corbyn, because he loves Iran. And I was like,
it's quite a leap, isn't it? I'm trying to join those two things up, and it's not
They're
really...
also really good at making rice. I love Iran too. I mean, have you had a Tahdig? Oh my God.
It's I basically agree with that. There's something very peculiar that's happened here, which I think is the sort of shift, if you step back a bit, the shift from a British nationalism to an English nationalism. And the Conservative Party is still the Conservative and Unionist Party. They certainly still call themselves that on occasion. And like, really, looking at these results, it's like, forget the Unionists. No, this is like, forget Scotland, forget Northern Ireland, forget anything that would qualify you talking about Unionists. I mean, we still got Wales, but that's been there for a good long period of time. So without wanting to sound dismissive, but I think fairly clearly, it's not featuring very highly in any Tory members' Brexit considerations. What's striking about it is that it is not the British nationalism, the kind of person that Nigel Farage would cite, but none of the people in that panel would cite, and it's someone I'm wary of citing on Navarra Media, and it's what Enoch Powell would talk about if he's describing nationalism. Quite famously he said he would fight for his country if it went communist. Now, if you look at those results, like, Jeremy Corbyn's not a communist, but these people will not. They don't want this anymore if it means Jeremy Corbyn. So it's quite a distinctive sort of ideological take on all of this that's come through that's different to what you might have seen 40, 50, 60 years ago around a particular variant of British nationalism specifically. So it's something new that we're starting to look at now.
Oh, let's look at who the Tories want. So, I mean, it seems like a somewhat predictable race in that no one is really predicting that anyone other than Boris Johnson will win. He's far away the favourite in the bookies. Gary, we can get up who Tory members want. So, percentage of Conservative Party members who think each candidate would make a good leader. Boris Johnson is way in the lead on 77%. Dominic Raab on 68%. Obviously, he was removed from the race today when he didn't get enough nominations from MPs. He got prorogued. Yeah, very good. Sajid Javid, actually not that bad on 61%. I think he did okay in today's debate. Jeremy Hunt on 56%, Michael Gove on 50%, and Rory Stewart on 31%. These members do not want someone who is trying to revive the withdrawal.
It's only like Lib Dems and pundits love him.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, you wrote an article sort of dissing Rory Stewart, didn't you? Although
I think it wasn't dissing Rory Stewart himself, because I don't think there's much point. I was sort of dissing the warm orifices opened up for him across various parts of the commentariat. It was so uncritical and so undignified. I'm so sorry.
Is your warm orifice opening for Rory Stewart?
It was just.
He actually looked at times in the debate as if his warm orifice was opening. Yeah. I wonder if we can get that little clip up actually. This is what it looks like when
it's a hell of a sprawl.
This whole like Magic Mike approach to dominating the leadership debate.
Yeah, that's Rory Stewart's warm orifice opening there. Anyway, sorry, Ash, we interrupted you there. What's your take on Rory Stewart?
No, I was talking about the warm orifices because, and the reason why I think is important is because we might not think of a figure like David Ivanovic, who's a very sort of, aggressive, bristling figure, as someone who's
There's no one you can name whose warm orifice we're not going to think of right now. But anyway, sorry, go on.
So you may not think of.
Everyone's got one.
At least. So I hear.
Even David Ivanovic. But all of these figures who just a few months ago, when Chuka Umunna and Anna Soubry and Joan Ryan and Luciana Berger and all the rest of them jumped ship and formed Change UK, said, this is what we have been looking for, and exalted them as a return to grown-up, managerial, technocratic politics. And the use of that phrase, the adults in the room, grown-up politics, was really striking to me. It was the sense of, you've let the children play with populism for long enough, and so now someone's going to come in and be sensible. Ian Birrell, who used to be a speechwriter for David Cameron, said that the look of Rory Stewart is of a grown-up who's returned to the noisy kindergarten of Brexit-dominated politics. So he was being received
on opium, and everyone else is fucking freaked out.
Just sort of like wandering in, like, blinking eccentric. And I realised that what they're responding to, one is they look reasonable compared to the other people who are likely to be Prime Minister in terms of the Conservative Party, but also look reasonable in the sense of they're able to have a good go at impersonating what a non-ideological politic would look like. Now, of course, it is intensely ideological, and that was the thing that I was trying to point out with Rory Stewart, is that he is very much an ideologue, and it shows in choice that he has made in terms of his voting record. And then, of course, when I wrote this article, which is sort of like unpicking the reception of Rory Stewart by the pundit class got very, very annoyed at me. And David Aranovich and Jason Cowley in particular, very snooty. They were like, oh, so I suppose Jeremy Corbyn is the grown-up choice. And I was like, did you read the fucking article, man? Also, yes.
But also, yes.
I don't normally take comments mid-show, but I think this is a factual, direct point, so it's important, to intervene with it. This is from Max Shanley. Opium's more likely to tighten your warm orifice, actually. So smack addicts are plagued by constipation, something I know owing to having watched Train Spotting.
A valuable source of life advice in many different ways.
Still warm, isn't it?
I wouldn't know.
It's less of an orifice, I think.
I'm Muslim, Michael.
Rory Stewart's the one person who could turn up to like a nursery where they're talking about Brexit on opium and nothing bad would happen, because if you're in the MI6 you can squash those kind of problems quite easily. I think the history of the British establishment shows you. Anyway, you were talking about... Are
you coming to me straight after that interjection?
You know about the deep state. You were talking about how these centrists are gushing over Rory Stewart because they think he is the adult in the room when you've got lots of kids, promising wild or making wild promises, playing to the mob, not being particularly realistic. I mean, one thing that this Tory leadership campaign is characterised is by people not being particularly realistic. So I want to know from you, James, someone who knows more about policy, economic outcomes than I do. You've got Boris Johnson on stage, you've got Sajid Javid on stage, Michael Gove kind of on stage, and Jeremy Hunt almost there as well. They're all saying we will countenance a no-deal Brexit. Are these candidates all making promises to their membership that they cannot keep?
They all backed away from it. If you watch them, they all slithered around a bit on the question, but they all basically backed away from saying they'll do a no-deal Brexit. Every single one of them, if pushed, from my memory, was, it's just it's a negotiating position. You have to look like you're really serious about this negotiating position. And then they say, would you actually do it? Oh, well, it's a negotiating position. You have to look really serious about it, which is not the same as saying, yes, you'll actually do it, at which point it's a useless negotiating position because it's obvious it's just a negotiating position. The person who was really enthusiastic about a no-deal Brexit to the point of like he will destroy parliamentary democracy, Dominic Raab, has now been eliminated. So you're left with a bunch of basically chancers who know full well that this is a really bad, difficult idea and they're not going to be able to deliver it. But the way they can look like they're going to deliver it in a way that seems like the grown-up politics we all care about is that it's just a cunning negotiating position, but everybody and their dog, including everybody in the EU, will know that they're not serious about this. There is no one who's serious about no-deal Brexit. That doesn't mean it can't happen. Things can happen by accident. Things can happen because nobody wants it and you just end up with this anyway. But really, if push comes to shove, the question is how rapidly can they sell not a no-deal Brexit, which almost certainly looks like the withdrawal agreement we already have, plus or minus some bells and whistles, nothing to do with what Europe will give you because they won't give you anything, what they can give to the Labour side or anybody else who might vote for it, and that's the only thing that's going to be different. The only person who's honest about that is Rory Stewart, and he's the only person who has the clear position on this.
I just want to refresh our memories on no deal Brexit. So Gary, can we prep the clip? Hands up if you will leave by 31st of October. And while that's being prepared, Ash, what were you going to say?
I mean, one of the things that I was going to say is that something that came out today and was reported on by The Guardian is that Boris Johnson's been going around making wild promises to Conservative MPs in private. So he's trying to appear socially liberal and centrist to socially liberal Tories and to centrist Tories. He's trying to look like a no-deal headbanger to no-deal headbangers. And one of the things that he might find is that whatever cosmetic changes he might be able to secure on the backstop, because this nonsense of we will simply get rid of the backstop, we will simply renegotiate the backstop, is a complete fiction, might not be enough to placate the likes of Steve Baker and those sort of real ERG wing nuts in his party. I think one of the things which hasn't come up in any of these debates, and I think really should, because I think it's got implications for what happens next to the Conservative Party, and also has very serious implications for what happens with Labour's approach to Brexit and how it can continue holding its current line or might have to tack more towards Remain, is how likely would Nigel Farage be to do a deal with Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the event of an early general election, because lots of this no deal posturing is to achieve one thing and one thing only, which is to claw back Brexit Party voters from Nigel Farage and get them voting Conservative again. And every single other candidate in that debate, even the OG leaver Michael Gove, will no doubt inspire the Brexit Party to run their candidates against Tories in key seats. Whereas Johnson is the only one who I could see opting perhaps for an early general election, putting no deal on his manifesto, because there would be no other way to get it through Parliament or make it happen, and secure a deal with Nigel Farage for him not to have the Brexit Party stand against him. You don't think that's likely?
I just don't think there's a chance. I don't think. I mean, look, it's never say never, particularly after the last few years. It's possible there'll be an early general election, but it's incredibly unlikely. The Fixed Term Parliament Act basically means that a government that doesn't want to go to an early general election doesn't have to do it. And what every single, in fact, they've just done it publicly, really, but what they've been doing in private, I would have thought, every single candidate standing is going to every Tory MP and basically letting me know there is no way on God's earth that they will have an early general election. You might have seen the Daily Mail 2 days ago had Boris Johnson's camp noisily declaring that whatever you may have thought from his rather loose-lipped speech that was being spun, presumably by Michael Gove, as, you might call an early general election. No. Boris Johnson is not going to call an early general election. Now, Boris Johnson's saying something, you can either believe it or not believe it as you see fit, but broadly speaking, it's quite hard to persuade a bunch of MPs that you've insisted that you will not have an early general election to then vote for one because you've decided circumstances are changed or things are just difficult or for whatever reason. So, frankly, I think the most likely date for the election remains 2022. So we're going to be here for a long time, which is a depressing thought in very, very many ways. Unless something big turns up, some big external factor intervenes. That's where we're going to get to. So in terms of the Brexit Party and the calculations you make with it, the real calculation is, will the Brexit Party sustain itself until 2022, which is when your election is? Can you guarantee that? No, you can't. Look at the history of UKIP over the last 20 or 30, what is it now, 25 years? Up and down and up and down and up and down for a good long period of time. The latest permutation has done more damage than previous permutations UKIP did, but it's within the zone of what UKIP was able to achieve at European elections. So your calculation really is, will the Brexit Party survive? No. Your second order calculation might be, what does Nigel Farage have to be bribed with to shut up and go away for a bit, to quote the late lamented Defence Secretary at that point. Lord Farage and a seat in the cabinet, who knows? Whatever it takes. And you
think that'd be enough?
Would it be enough to get Nigel Farage what he wants? Yeah, I think he'd quite like the laurel wreaths and the looking important. I think that's broadly speaking what Nigel Farage is after in all of this. Maybe he's got a longer term, more serious plan. Maybe it's how we're going to reconstruct the right in Britain, because the Conservative Party is now a party on its last legs, rather visibly. That doesn't mean they disappear and suddenly it's whoopee-doo socialism forever. It could well mean the Brexit Party or something like AFD or something far worse that appears in its place, but nonetheless this does not look like a viable project for the British right at this point in time. A softer version of that might be what starts to happen around a candidate like Rory Stewart, who can present himself as the grown-up in the room, the sensible one. By the way, there's a kind of colonial metaphor here, isn't there? I'm the grown-up who's going to sort out the kids, and here comes Rory Stewart, who spent his time in Afghanistan, apparently not working for MI6 or whatever it was he wasn't doing, who's going to be, sorting out the various squabbling tribes and all the rest of it. So he's going to do the same thing for British politics, which is nice. So potentially you could reconstruct it around a kind of centrist vision. The trouble is you're still stuck with actually having to deliver the only thing that we have to deliver. The only thing that looks like the Brexit that can be delivered, which is the withdrawal agreement, which has been completely upfront about saying that's what we're going to do. And that's Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, which is a car crash, by the way. There is no way anyone on the left should support this under any circumstances whatsoever. But that's the only deal in the room, and that's what they're going to try and get through.
All right, we're going to go on to sort of like the practicalities of can Brexit be delivered on the 31st of October. But before we do that, we're going to hear what the candidates in today's debate said to, the question of whether they will be able to leave on the 31st of October. So we're going to get that up now.
We will continue to hemorrhage support.
Anyone on the stage guarantee it yet? Can you just raise your hand if there is a guarantee to leave by October the 31st? Just raise your hand if you can guarantee that.
Let me just ask you this question. Okay, so I would agree with you. If the only way...
We were doing a sort of difficult technical thing there that didn't quite work, which is I was going to put the video... Well, I was going to put the video on my laptop so we could hear it, but then I didn't do it quite in time anyway. they were struggling to confirm whether or not they were going to leave on the 31st of October. Potentially it made more sense to the people who were watching it, I'm not sure.
This is why you've got to go to support.novaramedia.com because with more funding, we're going to have a better tech team than Michael with his finger on the button.
We could never have a better tech team. Oh, you mean than me with my finger on the thing? Okay, yeah.
No,
however much money you give to us, we're keeping Gary. All right. Right.
Whatever it takes. Okay.
Can we leave on the 31st of October, James?
Yes.
What? How? Tell us how that can possibly.
Well, you pass a withdrawal agreement and you've done it,
and is that likely to happen?
Well, this depends on a number of other things coming to play. Not most of which probably don't depend on the outcome of the Conservative leadership election. So, and this is a sort of hypothetical situation. But let's imagine Labour goes to a sort of clear and visible Remain position, and you have a Tory leader that says, "I am committed to delivering the existing withdrawal agreement." So there's no messing around trying to renegotiate or any of this absolute nonsense that the other candidates have gone for. That gives a licence to various backbench Labour MPs who think that they need to vote leave to vote for leave, because now Labour's a Remain party. They don't have to vote with the party whip because you're still going to get Brexit at some point, so you can vote against it, and then potentially you get your withdrawal agreement through. If I was Rory Stewart, my calculation, if he's made that calculation, would look a bit like that. I am leader of the Tory party. We are sticking to the existing withdrawal agreement. Labour has moved to more Remain position. Therefore, we can get the withdrawal agreement through.
I think Rory Stewart's the one person who has a coherent argument, because he's saying, if I were elected Tory party leader, I could get through the withdrawal agreement. And I think that is true, because he would have, by having gone to the Tory party membership, if it was clear that the Tory party membership were happy with this withdrawal agreement, then clearly that would give these Tory MPs, or any Tory MPs who are wavering, reason to back it. And as you say, if Labour went to a second referendum position, then you'd get some of the sort of Labour leavers backing it well.
You potentially, at least you could calculate, you're not potentially a few more in favour of that withdrawal agreement, yes.
I mean, he's not going to... Oh, shit. He's...
You did a real life Anna. Ooh.
Yeah. Ooh. Yeah, that's true. He's not going to win, though. So what, Rory Stewart?
Why not?
Because we just talked about the nature of the Tory party membership. They're not going to elect... So the only way Rory Stewart could win a Tory party election is if he did the whole Jeremy Corbyn style, you can join for £1, and I think there would be enough centrists with moist orifices to potentially pay that £1. So that was the analogy we were working with, was it? Warm. A warm orifice is a moist orifice. He's not going to win.
I'm trying not to think about it.
The only way Rory Stewart could win is if they did a sort of like affiliated members or registered supporters kind of way, where he could attract a bunch of centrists into the party to put him into power.
You're saying things with enough certainty to win me over, and then I think about it and I'm going, wait, how the fuck? Wait.
He can't win. Tell us how he could win.
All right, the route to it, if you're Rory Stewart, and this is very, very slender, right? There's not very much going on here, but working on the basis that Boris Johnson is manifestly unfit for office, and if you're fairly serious and you would like British capitalism to stop being so grossly dysfunctional, and you're prepared to try and make this happen, and you are therefore attached to the Tory party in some form. I mean, look at his performance today. He was inadequate. And if we have even a reasonably long, I mean, I thought it was a bit longer than it is, but it's not. It's only 6 weeks after the end of this week for the members to decide. If it was the rest of the summer, Boris Johnson would be toast under any credible sort of actual leadership campaign. I mean,
not with that membership, he would not be.
Stacked up. All right, wait until the entire British press suddenly lumber behind whoever seems to be the credible Brexit candidate who might be able to deliver Brexit but doesn't come with all the appalling baggage. Wait until you got everyone lining up and saying, the withdrawal agreement's not great, but Theresa May tried her best, and it's the best we can do.
You could have said that about Donald Trump in the Republican primaries. If people want their extremist candidate, they'll vote for their extremist candidate, and it will be Boris Johnson. They will try to.
And broadly speaking, the bit that counts against all of this is that exactly it. It's like you will have a bunch of people who want to vote for Boris Johnson because they want to vote for Boris Johnson, and they're not going to be easily dislodged. But if you had to write out a plan about how that doesn't happen, this is what it would look like. And given the baggage that Boris personally brings to it, given his, I think, actual inadequacies in terms of dealing with the pressures of a real campaign where there is actual scrutiny being applied to you, I don't think he will be able to cope with that. If you have the entire press suddenly lined up and saying, do you know what, we're actually not super keen on Boris Johnson anymore, actually we want the withdrawal agreement to happen, not this crazy stuff, we need someone who can reach across the aisles to deliver it, whoever it is, that's your route to actually winning the thing.
I think that's highly, highly unlikely. Yeah. And the thing is that every single serious prediction I've made in politics has turned out to be wrong. Every single jokey prediction I've ever made has turned out to be right. And my jokey prediction has been there's going to be a no-deal Brexit. So just putting that on the table as number one. But number two, I think that's highly unlikely. Polling has showed that consistently, at least half of the Tory membership went out and voted Brexit Party at the European elections. And so that means that the membership who will be voting for our next Prime Minister will not be behaving rationally. You've got half of that membership being dead set on wanting a no-deal Brexit, and you've got the other half of that membership thinking, how do we win back our own membership and also the voters who we have lost back to voting for the Conservative Party. So one of the things that will be happening is this sort of act of political ventriloquism, which is, I don't necessarily like Boris Johnson, but there is a big red button with his name on it, and that is how we get Brexit through and defeat Jeremy Corbyn all at once. And that's the big Boris button. Where Rory Stewart will do well, younger Conservative Party members and also undecideds. But I think that both of those groups of people are very, very low in number. And that's why I think that simply there won't be that sort of calculation of like, okay, well, how do we stop British capitalism from being quite so dysfunctional? Okay, how do we have a candidate who doesn't have quite so much baggage in terms of, you know, unknown number of love children, various forms of ugly personal conduct, a record of dishonesty, can't trust them even as far as you can throw them. I don't think that that's the sort of thoughts that's going to be happening between now and the 22nd of July. It's,
as I said, it's a slender route to winning, but if you wanted to take it and you weren't Boris Johnson, this is what you do and this is what you try and rely on. The issue there is, look, this is kind of what David Cameron did. Right, David Davies in 2005, which I think is the last time the Tories had a really contested leadership election. I mean, it's really going back a bit. David Davies was the candidate who was going to win. He had the support of the membership. He had everything lined up. He was the favourite going into that contest. It flipped over entirely, partly because Cameron did what was widely reputed to be a brilliant speech at Tory conference where they had hustings, backed up by this overwhelming media campaign. David Cameron's won. David Cameron's going to rescue us from Labour, that sort of thing. And it was huge. Now, that's a Tory membership which I think, in terms of demography, looks actually quite similar to now. Right, it's still on the older end, the more obviously socially conservative, more obviously conservative voting end of the entire spectrum of the population here. It's probably changed and got more like that in the intervening period. That would be my assumption. I think there's also been people moving over from UKIP and all sorts of other things which definitely shifted that way. But it has happened before. Somewhat like this, that the apparently socially liberal, reach across the divide, centrist candidate comes through as if from nowhere, relatively new into Parliament, appears out of nowhere, Eton educated, no less, there you go, mind you, says Boris, appears out of nowhere and wins over a constituency and delivers it. Now, I think this is a very hard route for Rory Stewart or anybody else to walk, probably harder than walking across Afghanistan at this point in time. But nonetheless, it's there.
Walking across Afghanistan when you're allegedly a spook isn't actually that difficult.
You think it's probably like...
If you've got like your satellite phone and like an RPG or something, you're fine.
Right, it's like swimming the channel where you've got a safety boat or something. Actually, you probably ought to do that if you're swimming the channel, not having swum the channel. I really think you should have a safety boat. But I'm trying to think of a metaphor that works, and that one probably doesn't quite. But anyway, it's like it's a difficult path to follow, but it's not completely implausible. I don't see, given the fairly compressed timetable, it quite working. But then you're back into like, who is Boris Johnson really, and what does he really want? One, to be Prime Minister, this seems fairly clear. Two, shrug your shoulders, who knows? Who knows? Richard Nixon went to China, Boris Johnson does, stop Brexit. It's like, it feels to me that your range of uncertainties with him as Prime Minister are far wider than with any of the other candidates. Michael Gove will definitely try and do Brexit, I would have thought. He's quite committed to this. Rory Stewart will do the withdrawal agreement. He's quite committed to this. Sajid Javid, Jeremy Hunt, he's a sort of empty suit, really. Sajid Javid, a bit more interesting, actually.
So that's interesting, because I was going to push back on the idea that Tory party members are behaving irrationally, because I was going to say if they're behaving rationally and they don't care about the destruction of their party and all they care about is a hard Brexit, then Boris is the right person to go for. But you're actually saying that if what Tory party members really care about is a hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit or whatever, then Boris Johnson's actually a very risky person to get behind.
Who knows what he'll do? He's like, he is not someone who, when he says he will do a thing, is guaranteed to do that thing he says he will do. Right? We know this from his entire personal and political history. How did he run London? What he did? Well, he basically did nothing. He just sort of sat there and allowed all the bad stuff to carry on and did almost nothing else. A couple of failed schemes to build a bridge or whatever, right? And broadly speaking, he was socially liberal at the time. This was Boris Johnson who wanted to deliver an amnesty to migrants. And we don't have to go that far back. It's Boris Johnson who not that long ago was talking about global Britain, open to the world, buccaneering nation, we're all going to trade and all that sort of thing, pitching quite hard towards the kind of free trade, socially liberal end of Brexit rather than the pull up the drawbridges, send them all back end of Brexit, right? That's how he was behaving within, the last 2 years or so. So do you think he's going to suddenly do a no-deal Brexit because that's difficult? That's really difficult, by the way, and you have to take a lot of flack and everyone will hate you for it. Will Boris Johnson want to do that? Probably not.
It's interesting that that's not what his competitors are going for, because I was doing something on the radio with a right-wing journalist, asked what is the one thing that Boris Johnson could do that could, throw this race, that could lose his leadership, and he said if he was seen in any way to be softer on Brexit than his competitor. And what's surprising actually is that his competitors have gone on things that the membership don't care about, which is infidelity, or which is Islamophobia, or not being particularly clued up on the details, when the only thing the Tory party membership care about, as we can see from the survey results, is a hard Brexit. So what they should be going on is the fact that he's not genuinely an out-and-out conservative. This whole sort of, he is actually potentially not that committed to
there's
a
two
no-deal
things.
Brexit. He'd be a liberal if that was what was appropriate at the time.
I mean, the absolute hard no deal, ultimate no deal Brexit candidate, Dominic Raab, has disappeared because he was so committed to Brexit he would literally just end parliamentary democracy. Right, that's how much Brexit you're going to get with him. So he said he'd do that, and he's gone. So you're reduced to who is the next hardest on the Brexit issue. Is it really Boris Johnson? Well, up until fairly recently, was he ever that hard on Brexit? He's definitely this is the man who wrote 2 separate columns. On whether he's going to be remain or leave. How committed is he really? Now, there's an element of, I suspect, Tory MPs who, if nothing else, are at least reasonably calculating about their own personal sort of political survival, will have an awareness that there's a game you're playing with Boris Johnson, that he won't actually necessarily follow through on all the stuff he's going to tell all the membership, which would be my working assumption. And if you want to dig away at him, getting into that kind of what does he really mean? You saw it this evening. It wasn't a particularly good debate. Nobody was really put under pressure. Boris Johnson flapped quite rapidly without very much poking or probing from Emily Maitlis or any of the other candidates.
So one of the things that I would say, and this isn't something that you can measure, and this isn't something in which I've got a vast amount of data or historical precedent to back me up. It's one of those things where you sort of, lick your finger and see which way, the wind is blowing, is that there is something very similar in the way in which Boris Johnson campaigns and the effects that he has on people that support him that Trump has had. And one of the things that fell apart in 2016 with Trump's win were our criteria for judging what is a good campaign and what is a good debate performance, and what are the things that the base really care about when they're looking at a candidate. So lots of the things that we're saying about Boris Johnson in terms of has been incredible, has lacked integrity, hasn't been able to stick to a line, doesn't know detail, falls apart under any form of, prodding or probing, someone whose personal life is a complete mess, and someone, even on some of the most, deeply held issues to the electoral base, has flip-flopped around a bit, still manages to stake out a space for themselves by simply being an anti-systems candidate. So this is the person you can trust to tear the whole thing down. And I think that that's some of the value that Boris Johnson has. I would actually think that, in a weird way, and James Butler wrote this in his very good LRB piece recently, is that one of the main differences between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump is that Donald Trump actually does have some areas of policy that he genuinely feels incandescent and enraged about, whereas Boris Johnson, all he cares about is his slide and ooze towards number 10. But I would say that we risk having our expectations confounded the same way again, which is an incredibly sad thing to happen, because we're trying to apply the same criteria twice when the spirit of the times simply doesn't fit anymore.
I don't quite buy that as a description of how Donald Trump won. I think broadly you're right. You know, he could say, what did he say himself? He could shoot someone in Times Square and people would still vote for him, right?
Fifth Avenue.
Fifth Avenue. Sorry, yes. Well, does that matter?
Times Square would have been a red line. I don't think people have.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm wondering.
I'm
not. You know, my nuanced detail of American politics doesn't run quite that far to which street in New York you can shoot someone on as Donald Trump and people still vote for you. But nonetheless, it was one of the streets in New York. He could shoot people and people still vote for him. That is true for a great old chunk of his support. Similar for Boris Johnson. Is that enough to get you over the line? No. In the case of Donald Trump, well, we know this actually did lose a popular vote. I always feel that's a bit of a weedy thing to point out. It's like, he didn't actually get as many votes. Yeah, but he still won, right? And he won because in America, somewhat as here, but we can get onto the Tory leadership contest, it's actually not a very democratic or fair electoral system. And what Donald Trump did brilliantly and what Hillary Clinton's side did spectacularly badly was game the system. Donald Trump knew that he had to win 3 states, right? Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And he absolutely hammered them. And he had a message for people there, and he didn't really care that much about what everybody else is doing. Can Boris Johnson do the same thing? Can he game the system that well? Probably not. Probably not.
I was also thinking primaries in the campaign that Donald Trump ran against his other candidates.
That is where more of the can you round up a big old mob of people who really, really count in your favour comes through. I think that's right, and that's where the Trump Boris Johnson similarity holds water. The difficulty you got is that this comes down to 2 candidates, right? So it's 2 candidates who face the electorate. The primaries remain very open. Until you get, it's potentially anybody can win. So you always have the opportunity to appeal to a minority of the electorate who can carry you through. If Boris Johnson's appealing to a minority, now, because it's a Tory membership, you think, okay, it's a big old minority, probably majority really. I mean, look at the polling. You might also think, actually, some of it's going to be a bit wobbly, and some of it could be knocked around. And if it's 2 candidates, and one of them is this person who suddenly, what are they saying really? What's their background? What's their past? They're campaigning to be Prime Minister. You know, even our British press will at this point subject someone to a bit of scrutiny more than they've bothered to in the past. That will happen. Why do you think he's not appeared at any of these debates up until this point? Why do you think he's avoiding all journalist questions? He doesn't want that. And he's perfectly right to not want that because it's bad for him. If he has to do that over the next 6 weeks, facing one other candidate, this is risky for him. And he can lose this. I wouldn't say he will, and I certainly want to place my faith in the remaining members of the Tory party to not vote for Boris Johnson, but he could lose this. Now, the second order question from that is, will Boris Johnson be bad for the country? Yes, obviously, Tory PM rather. Who would Labour rather face, Boris Johnson or someone else, is an interesting question, particularly if it gets to 2022. And that, I think, is one for the left to think about.
What do you think is the answer to that question?
Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson.
You think we'd prefer to face Boris Johnson?
Absolutely, Boris Johnson. Absolutely. If the Tory members are daft enough to elect Boris Johnson, a completely known factor in British politics by this point, you know, where his weaknesses are, you know, what he's going to campaign on, he's already stuck his neck out and said, okay, we're going to raise the higher rate of tax to £80,000, so I'm going to make sure that like everybody in the top 5% of the country is really a lot better off now. If I want to run a campaign against someone, I'd want to run a campaign against Boris Johnson. Absolutely. The only thing that might work for him is, like, let's say he somehow does manage to deliver Brexit in some form. It'll be the withdrawal agreement. He's not getting much variation from that. You'll get a slight boost in the economy because the investment that's been held back for the last 2 years or so due to the uncertainty of not knowing about Brexit suddenly appears. The economy grows a bit. Things look all right for a while. Maybe then he'll go for an early election, but I doubt it because we've seen what happens if you do that. It's really difficult to call an early election.
I mean, I worry about Boris Johnson as an opponent, not because I think he's undefeatable, but so Stephen Bush has sort of like a somewhat persuasive or initially persuasive argument, which is to say that Boris Johnson's big argument for his electability and what they keep sort of proposing or bringing up in the leadership election is not only is he the person who can bring over Brexit Party voters, but he is the person who's won London, and so he is the person who could potentially win over metropolitan liberals. And the argument used against him is that was in 2008. Times have changed. People have become more... Well, I suppose they identify more with a social liberalism in a sort of concrete way that Boris Johnson, because he backed Leave, is now seen as against.
Yes.
But the thing that made me worry about this is I was speaking to my dad before this show, who was speaking to his Muslim neighbour with a headscarf, who quite liked Boris Johnson. I thought he was quite a intelligent, likable guy, potentially going to vote for him. And what I worry is this idea that people have hardened towards, liberals have hardened towards hating Brexit and therefore hating Boris Johnson doesn't really take into account the fact that a lot of people vote based on who they can relate to. And I don't think that Boris Johnson will be stupid enough to sort of make these big promises which people find objectionable. So I think he potentially could run a kind of relatable general election campaign.
So one thing which I found really interesting, and this happened to me the other night, I was doing Any Questions in Paignton in Devon, and the constituency that was in Torbay voted 63% to leave, and it has a Tory majority of 14,000. I don't think any of the people at the Paignton Theatre that night would mind me saying that the audience was almost entirely white. So literally the only people of colour in the building were myself and Thangham Debonair, the MP for Bristol West, I think.
Probably, yes.
Yeah.
I feel like I
they
should
have
know
a song
that.
for which is, oh, we're halfway there. Oh, Thangham Debonair. I went there for TWT and they were just singing it constantly. I couldn't stop them.
I was talking to a friend of mine afterwards, and my friend was like, "Is her first name really Thangham?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he was like,
"It's a good name. It's a good name."
She's into the song, I think.
Yeah, well, you would be. I mean, come on. If people are singing your
be.
name, that's a good sign.
But anyway, only people of colour in there, me and Thangham, and it was a very, very old audience. A very, very old audience. So sort of average age of 60. First question from the audience was about Boris Johnson. Jonathan Dimbleby turns to me and he's like, "Ash, you start." And I was like, okay, I'm just going to do my why I don't like Boris Johnson thing. And I'm going to just prepare myself for like a little like weird smattering of applause maybe. And that's it. I'm going to be torn apart by this audience. And the response was insane. It was like screaming, cheering, going on for ages. And I was looking like into the audience as well, because I was like, where is this noise coming from? Is this just like 5 lefties in here, like, making me feel really good about myself? And it wasn't. It was like lots of these much older voters. And I imagine that lots of them are, so I imagine that the audience for Any Questions maybe skews a lot more liberal, but a significant of that portion of that audience, I think, of conservative voters, and a significant portion of them, I think, voted leave. And what's interesting to me is that when you say, well, this is what we know about Boris Johnson, and he's really, really shit, and I can point to these things which exist in reality. And one of the things that was I did deliberately is I stayed away from talking about Islamophobia and race, and I went for him on his record in London, because that's seen as something very stronger, and that got a really good reaction. So yes, I think Boris Johnson has this sort of, lingering celebrity affability which people respond to, because people do, like, when people feel that they know a guy, they know something of his personality, warm to him a bit more. But his reputation, I think, is becoming more and more cemented as someone who cannot be trusted, who will say anything to get a sniff of power. And this isn't about liberals will reject him because he's seen as a hard Brexiteer and liberals hate Brexit. I think it's more of a case of liberals and also some conservatives find him as a person so distasteful that they'll turn against him in a general election.
I mean, you're persuaded by that one, right?
I mean, I'm persuaded by the fact that Boris Johnson isn't like some magic elixir that people just vote Conservative. What he brings to it, probably, if he brings anything to it, is in the enthusiasm of the Conservative base, and that can start to dwindle, and that may not be enough to carry through. Probably is, frankly. I mean, just to be clear, I think he's probably going to win, but it's not guaranteed. So we shouldn't sit there going, "Oh, it's definitely guaranteed." And if he does win, this is a problem for the Conservative Party. Not least of which is that he's a known quantity. He's been around a long time. We know what to say about him. We know what he's going to do. We know he's going to have to deliver, because he's going to have to deliver Brexit. And what do we know about Brexit? What will be the first thing that happens if Brexit happens? There'll be a campaign to rejoin the EU. immediately, right? So you automatically know where at least some of the political constellation is going to end up, right? And then Boris Johnson's having to work against that as well. So you can kind of see the ways to defeat him. In the way, and Jeremy Hunt, I think, is just too dull, really, to actually get anywhere.
He looks blinky and a bit sad.
He does inspire sympathy.
He looks like he was sort of deflating in his suit jacket.
It's a bit.
He's better sitting down. I think the chair really helped today.
Okay,
because on the Channel 4 debate, he looked like he was just constantly holding in a liquid shit, like really
no, but
awkward.
he does have
Whereas
this.
I think
We're back to moist
sitting down was
orifices
at least a
again.
relief.
He's got this incredible face where he
more
looks
than
like
moist.
he's constantly
Positively
hiding.
wet. Sorry, go
This
on.
is how you know, like Red Roar are going to be back on our case, like clipping. Like the thing that I think about Jeremy Hunt is that he looks like he's hiding a live tadpole under his tongue. He's got this sort of
you have a more graphic and imagination than I have, I think, Ash. That's not. I don't look at Jeremy Hunt and think live tadpole under tongue. I just sort of feel vaguely sorry for him, which I shouldn't, because he's been terrible
Clearly
in
I've
lots
had
and lots of ways.
a worse history with men than you do. If I'm like, yep, that's a live tadpole under your tongue. I've seen it once and I'd recognise it again.
Yeah.
So one thing that I think is potentially, and I thought I just had this maybe, I don't know, hasn't been taken account of, is that I think people
Mr.
think that
Relato-head.
if Boris Johnson has a snap election, people think he'll win off the coattails of anger about Brexit. And I actually think potentially the sooner the election happens, the more likely Corbyn is to win, because I think that sort of like Remain movement could be just as powerful electorally, especially in the cities.
Exactly.
And it's actually that if Brexit takes a backseat, Boris might be forgiven by many people for pushing for a hard Brexit. People might start to remember his sort of like likeable, sort of soft liberal charm that he had in London. Some liberals might come around to him. People will be terrified at this point of the Marxist Jeremy Corbyn and Marxist John McDonnell. And I think Boris could come through as sort of like a soft managerial option in 2022.
And this is your sensible sort of conservative managerial approach to this, which is you deliver Brexit and then pivot away from that as rapidly as possible. Now, the unfortunate truth here is that we will never ever escape Brexit. We can do Brexit, and Brexit will still be a feature in all of British political life for as long as there is a British political life. Like, this is now inescapable. This is just a thing we're all going to have to work with and talk about forevermore, unless we all give up and go and live in like a tropical island elsewhere, or just take to writing books or farming or something. Just drop out of politics entirely. Brexit is always going to be there. So we're stuck with this one. But nonetheless, you can see a pivot which goes, done the Brexit, it's withdrawal agreement, so the economic consequences initially look quite good, and then basically afterwards, you don't really notice how bad they are. They're just sort of there. And then by 2022, you've calmed things down and off you go. Right? That's a sort of sensible version of what you might want to do. And Boris Johnson, I think, is underneath all of this fairly sensible, and that was probably what his long-term plan is.
I just want to say first, while Ash is making her latest intervention, I'm going to be collecting questions. So start giving me your questions. Also, the only reason this double bill was possible tonight is your kind support. Tisky Sow and Navarra Media is only possible because of the kind donations of our supporters. If you are one of those, thank you very much. If you are not, please go to support.navarramedia.com and kindly donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. As ever, please like this video. It means it appears in more people's feeds. Share it on Twitter. Share it on Facebook. You know the score. Anyway, Ash, sorry.
One person that we've forgotten to talk about is Mr. Relato Head, Sajid Javid, who we commented looked relatable because he looked very nervous and also looked like Mr. Potato Head, so that was synthesised to Mr. Relato Head. I don't actually think we have to talk about him very much. He tried to do a sort of appeal to like hard nationalism, stripping the citizenship away from, anyone he, crossed paths with. Didn't work. Tried to be a bit Ayn Rand fanboy, and I think that is closer to who he is. Didn't necessarily resonate with people particularly well, and now he has become the Muslim candidate, even though he is not himself a practicing Muslim, and he's sort of the way into talking about Islamophobia, talking about issues of racism in the Conservative Party, and I don't feel that that's a particularly comfortable place for him to be in. He got that sort of concession from people of, yes, there'll be an investigation into Islamophobia in the Conservative Party. But I think ultimately he's really lost sight of what his role is within the Conservative Party. He thought he could carve out a particular persona for himself as Home Secretary, and he's been surprisingly unsuccessful at doing that, I think, in terms of how he's viewed within his party. The thing that I would maybe briefly like to talk about is where Labour is at the moment.
Yeah.
Because quite understandably, there's been, I think, quite a deliberate retreat from media, apart from Laura Pidcock on Tiski's Hour earlier tonight, by most of the Labour front bench. Because why would you interrupt your enemies while they're making a mistake? Why would you inject yourself into the bun fight when it's blue on blue violence, right? Yeah. So those are sort of standard political rules. But I think that we also shouldn't underestimate the crisis of decision making that is occurring for the Labour Party right now. And part of that crisis is hoping against hope that while you do nothing, people's perception of you can somehow remain the same. And I think that that's the approach to this summer. And I find it difficult to anticipate Jeremy Corbyn intervening and doing a sort of big Brexit volte-face that lots of people had predicted for him after the European elections result. And I think, only time will tell whether or not that's the right thing to do. But I think one thing that people feel a loss of is a loss of presence of the opposition at this point in time, where it feels that there is this reshuffle of power within the Conservative Party. It has consequences for all of us, and yet the alternative, that new world which is not only possible but is breathing and nearly here, it doesn't feel quite so real. It doesn't feel quite so immediate. And I think that that's a consequence of the Tory leadership race, which really needs dealing with and thinking about in quite a serious way. And unfortunately, I don't see that happening.
I think before you answer, there's two questions that link to that, and I'd like to get them in. So Jimmy O'Keefe, do you think Labour will support a people's vote? And Matt Dodds, should Labour move to supporting a second referendum? But I think you can link that in whatever was going to be your answer to Ash there.
Well, the obvious, look, the answer is the answer is to quote Barry Gardiner quoting Napoleon quoting Sun Tzu, which is never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. And that is, as we know on the Labour side from bitter experience, quite personal bitter experience on my part, leadership elections do not go down well with the broader mass of people who frankly don't really care that much about politics and sort of want things to be run well and want certain things, but don't really want to see a major political party having a good old summer yelling abuse at each other and tearing chunks out of each other, right? They really don't like that. If you trace, take what happens when Jeremy Corbyn's elected, 2015 through to 2016, and then you hit the leadership election, this is the point at which the polling goes bad. Right, and the risk of the Conservative Party, although they have more institutional basis to draw on, they won't have to face a continually hostile and aggressive and sort of weirdly, it's not intrusive isn't the word, but it's kind of picking on details media in quite the same way we have. We know that this is going to be the case. There's still a good risk that a long summer, even a fairly short summer, of them tearing chunks out of each other looks bad and it'll damage them in the polls, right? And then it takes a while to recover from that. So that's the reason why you don't necessarily want to turn up and start talking too much yourself, because you kind of detracts attention from the fact people are having a massive bun fight that they should get on with. 2016 was incredible, by the way. We had frankly, it was a pointless leadership election. We shouldn't have had it. Right? There's no real reason to it, but we had it anyway. And it just allowed the Tories to go, we should have a leadership election as well, but we're not going to. Here's Theresa May. Ta-da. And then suddenly they rebounded in the polls, and this is what we're going to do. And that was the story all the way through until 2017, when it all sort of fell apart. That isn't quite what's going to happen this time round, I don't think. But the fact that the Tories are going to have to spend at least a certain amount of time all being relatively aggressive with each other is not going to work well for them in terms of broader political support, broader public support. The difficulty is who do they end up with out the other side? If it's Boris Johnson, the question for them is, or this person, if it is Boris Johnson, is what are they going to say by Conservative conference? And that will be very, very close to the October 31st date. You've got a very brief period of time where there's any normal parliamentary debate, and then it's conference season, then there's a bit of time, then you hit October the 31st. To me, it looks very difficult to decide what you're actually going to do at that point. If you're going to try and pull something together around a deal, you're going to have to work very, very fast on this. So probably if you're elected Tory leader at all, you're going to have to say straight away what your rough plan is for the next few weeks or so, for the next sort of months leading up to October the 31st. That's quite hard to do if it's going to have to be a difficult decision at that point in time. It's going to have to be a decision that is and it probably will, there'll be a lot of pressure to make this happen, a pivot away from the absolute hard Brexit, for example. Right? So that's one part of it. On the Labour side, there is a sort of reduced form version of that. which, put it this way, as soon as there was a withdrawal agreement on the table, and details of it were leaked after about, a Chequers meeting or something last summer, wasn't it? You start to get a sense of where they're going to go. As soon as there's something on the table or a bit on the table, the space in which you can sort of go, well, here's the process argument, here's what we kind of like out of Brexit, that starts to close down because there is a Brexit on the table. And to be absolutely clear, the withdrawal agreement plus the outline political declaration, which we don't really talk about enough, but is even worse, is an absolute car crash for the left, right? It does one thing that I think is morally something we shouldn't be doing, morally and politically, which is it just trashes freedom of movement. The primary aim of Theresa May's deal is to end freedom of movement, and then it's basically everything else can go hang. So it does that, and then at great expense it sort of manages to wiggle out of this, and there's lots of costs to sort of still be involved with the single market. P.S. it includes a whole load of stuff around state aid, around competition law, and all the things that everybody in the left normally objects to. So it's an absolute car crash. It's an abomination of a deal. No one on the left should support it. But nonetheless, this is the shape of Brexit. And at that point, the situation becomes polarised. Because either you're kind of in favour of this sort of thing, or something a bit like it, because that's Brexit, or you don't like this sort of thing. And every single time Theresa May drags a bloody deal back through Parliament, and every single time you have the same debates, that polarisation gets worse. And you can see that, I think, happening quite clearly over the period of time it was being debated, that everybody ends up, increasingly, with this sort of hardy band in the middle. It's probably still the majority, really, or a bit like, for God's sake, just make it end. Between Remain, we really, really, really hate Brexit, and Leave, we really, really love Brexit, and this would be but more, thank you very much. Right? And in a polarised situation, it is extremely hard to maintain a position which is looking at the process, which is attempting to balance all sides off, right?
I mean, so here's what I think about it, which is, morally, trying to achieve some kind of Brexit compromise was the right thing to do. Trying to depolarise the discussion was the right thing to do. I think it was doomed from the start, but morally I can get on board with it. Now, looking at that process of deepened polarisation, in which the Brexit option and what it means for most of the public is a no-deal Brexit, has sort of swept the idea of a negotiated Brexit off the table, at least in the minds of most people. You then think, okay, well, does Labour stick with what it's doing now, which is a set of institutional arrangements which not very many people care about, and the bit which people do care about, which is ending freedom of movement, is something which its membership, the people that will go out and campaign for Labour, most of its voters really quite fiercely want to protect. Or do you try and harden your Brexit position? Impossible, not going to happen. Or do you go for one of two options, which is second referendum, which has got Remain on the ballot? Or do you go for what someone has referred to as woke revoke to me? Woke revoke being, we're going to revoke Article 50, we're going to put together all sorts of ding battery to talk about what Brexit is, and we'll revisit it at the end of the next parliamentary term and hope that none of you care very much, right? And those being the other two options. In that context, the second referendum looks like the compromise option to me. The problem is that I think that we're still viewing both Labour's 2017 coalition and the electoral coalition which delivered Brexit in very, very flawed terms. So I think one of the things that we do is we persistently imagine that Labour levers are the hardest possible levers out there. That actually represents a real minority of Labour levers. Labour levers are
they're kind of chilled, right?
The
chilled levers.
They're the most chilled levers.
This is what the polling says, yeah.
A betrayal of Leave voters is a betrayal of Labour's working class voters. Well, working class Leave voters made up 15% of the 2017 coalition. Working class Leave voters. This is according to a YouGov thing which I read today. And you've got roughly the same amount of working class Remain voters. And so one of the things that starts happening is you start relying on these what I would term culturalist understandings of class, which start pulling in our assumptions about race, our experiences of deindustrialization, where they're to be found, whether it's in towns or big urban centres, so on and so forth. And then we start concocting a story of any betrayal of Leave is a betrayal of Labour's working class, all of Labour's working class voters. And again, like, this is a very flawed prism through which to view the project of holding together the 2017 coalition, building on it, or indeed looking at what delivered the 2016 vote in the first place.
No, I broadly agree with that. I think it's I think the sort of flawed way of looking at how people vote and why they vote next time round is partly what's driving this, and people have ended up clinging to versions of, not so much reality, but versions of what a vote looks like that aren't necessarily quite there in practice. I think you're absolutely right on Labour's Leave vote. If you ask Labour leavers what do they care about, they care about, and this is completely understandable, a whole load of other things that you might anticipate, like the economy, education, the NHS, before they hit Brexit. So whereas you can go on the other side and ask sort of lots of Remainers who are Labour or Lib Dem and that kind of thing what they really care about, and often they'll say Brexit, like sort of ironically because they're Remainers, but that's the polarisation that seems to be happening on the polling. If you take the idea of like how do you get a coalition that actually wins for Labour next time round, it's quite hard. Actually, the fundamental in this one is very, very simple. Like, if Labour does not have the support of its mass membership, which is 500,000 and up, and the Tories say it's 170,000 for them, it's less. The Lib Dems claim 100,000, right? This is an overwhelming advantage relative to all of your opponents. If you do not have that membership, you will not win the election. This is just, take this as the absolute rock bottom thing that needs to happen. In 2017, without that membership, mobilised and thinking, do you know what, this might be the only shot we get. Now, it turns out we get a second shot, but this might be the only shot we get to make Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister. Without that, we would not have delivered the nearly 10% increase in Labour's vote share. In 2017, it would not have happened. You can write whatever clever manifesto you want. You can do a couple of brilliant speeches, which Jeremy did. You can do the campaign and all the rest of it. It would not happen. So your absolute limit on what is achievable by the Labour Party in terms of Brexit is what do the members want, right? That I think is quite clear.
What's astonishing to me is
let's do this quickly because I want to do quick fire on a bunch of good questions we've got from the audience, and then we should end kind of soon because it's been
really
over an hour.
Thing. To my memory, and you can probably correct me on this,
Yep.
Labour haven't done a mass membership drive.
Don't think so.
Since
Not as
2017.
such. Yeah.
Why not?
That's a very good question.
Yeah, go on. Why not, James?
Well, I know. It's literally, I've been
You've
sitting
been
there
involved
going,
long enough.
I know, and this is entirely my
Right, in your
responsibility.
Corbynomics book.
I know. I
James.
sit there in my big chair.
I'm sorry, and I know
people
I'm
come
saying
to me
this
saying,
as
"Why don't
someone-
we have a mass membership?" I was like, "No, we must not do that." That's what happens.
I'm saying this as someone who isn't even a member, but like.
Yeah, come to think of it, hang on a minute. Actually, you shouldn't have raised that because I've forgotten. But yeah, if
500,000.
Well, you can start your membership drive now. Get reformed.
exactly, it's like I could get the form out and you can sign up.
I'm not going to join. But what I'm
Or-
saying is that tactically, it seems to me crazy that Labour haven't done a mass membership drive.
They actually have put in place things like the community organising and this sort of thing. So it's kind of solidifying the membership in certain areas with results that I think we're starting to see coming through. The sets of local council elections results just back in April, wasn't it? April, May, were really interesting in terms of where Labour did well. And this is a pointer to the future, by the way.
I know, but I think that's in terms of like training up your activists, but in terms of just like building up your numbers, going, you know what we want is, 750,000 by the next election.
Yeah. But you need a really, really solid offer.
All right, we want to get through these questions, right?
Anyway, sorry.
Quick fire round. You get about 30 seconds for each of them. Walter Benjamin asks, if Boris wins...
The Walter Benjamin.
Well, Walter X Benjamin.
Oh, okay.
So maybe
yes, I suppose
different.
he is in some ways Walter X Benjamin.
Ex-Walter Benjamin.
Yeah. His orifice is dried up long time.
that was completely unnecessary.
James, if Boris wins, how quickly is Scotland gone? 30 seconds.
Oh, God, not very quickly, actually, I don't think. That depends on the SNP leadership in the first instance. Do they really, truly want independence, or do they think they have quite a nice setup up there where you can always blame Westminster for bad things and take the credit for good things? So that's a question to ask.
Ash, Joseph O, is personality politics inescapable?
I think that personality politics has always been important. I think one of the things that when people say the phrase personality politics, what they mean is mediatized celebrity politics, and that's something which I think is specific to now. But personality-driven politics, well, you saw that when Ernst Thälmann would always do his bit at KPD rallies of showing up in a suit and tie and then show that he was a man of the people, taking off the suit jacket and taking off the tie, doing a bit of a Rory Stewart.
Yeah, Rory Stewart,
in
same
fact. So personality politics has always been there.
Mr. Play demands, this is for you, James. How do you think the Conservatives will fare in terms of climate issues in the 2022 general election or sooner?
Oh, blimey. Right, I think climate will be a doorstep issue by then, and it is already. I mean, it's, number 3 in the list of voters' concerns on current polling, shot up out of nowhere. There will be a Conservative response to this. Michael Gove has done more than anybody in the Conservative side to try and carve out that position. It's based on work by Bright Blue, a think tank just after the 2017 election on, environment is something the Conservatives need to get into. There are more radical and unpleasantly radical right-wing versions of that. You can see a sort of rise of green nationalism across Europe. The Front National, what do they call themselves now? National Rally in France have put it as centrepiece of their programme. So this will be a doorstep issue, and it's not one that will necessarily fall to the left. There will be a right-wing response to it.
Ash, Peter Manuel, what are your thoughts between Johnson doing a deal with Farage in order to join the right? Boris PM and Farage as deputy. Anyone?
I don't know how that would work in terms of Farage as deputy, because I actually don't know enough about how it works in terms of getting someone into the House of Lords and then getting someone into your cabinet and all the rest of it. So, I don't necessarily think that's likely. But in terms of what I had in mind was a deal by which Boris Johnson struggles to get anything through Parliament. Mm-hmm. He's like, fuck it, I'm going to go for no deal, snap general election, no deal on the manifesto, and that's the deal by which I don't get the Brexit Party contesting seats. That's what I was asking you about.
James, Phil BC, if Johnson wins, how likely is the Tory party split?
Ooh, that's a very good question. Not very likely because they'll rally. My working assumption is whoever wins rallies the Tories.
Ash, Barney W, question, will the Telegraph stay loyal to Bojo?
Yeah, they've made a very good investment in him, and I think that he's been, remarkably malleable to the wishes of the people who've been paying him all this time.
So what was that front page today all about? Why talk up for
Rory being a spy?
Yeah, Rory the spy. It's something that goes down well with Telegraph readers.
Turns out the Tory party membership is kind of anti-imperialist. Interesting.
Miscalculations happen.
Okay. No, I'll go with that.
Eduardo Piraz asks, what do you think will be the effect of a no-deal Brexit and a long-delayed recession in the next year or so on the political landscape? James?
God, it's always right. One thing that the left should never, ever do is assume that because there's a big recession, everyone decides capitalism is bad and therefore decides to support you. This happened in 2008, 9, 10. And then we got 10 years of austerity, or just about. This isn't what happened. So first one is, let's not try and rest all our calculations on there being a big recession, then people will think we're right. Let's think about what we actually want to do and try and work towards achieving that.
Ash, Average Joe asks, if Boris Johnson fudges Brexit, will the Brexit Party immediately undercut the Tory party and result in the Tories losing any future general election?
Depends what you mean by Brexit fudge. So any deal, any negotiated Brexit will be perceived as a fudge. And what matters is whether the sort of symbolic elements of that fudge, like cosmetic changes to the backstop, etc., are able to secure the support of the ERG. Because I think if you get the most nutty headbangers on board and saying, yes, this is the only Brexit we're going to get and we're all for it, you actually lose that sort of respectable wing that the Brexit Party will rely on in order to make their case. Because don't forget, they're a collection of very odd people, very weird people. And I think that they need that sort of respectable wing of the Tory party, even though they're quite nuts themselves, in order to be taken seriously.
James, Peter Carmichael asks, how does the Labour Party regain in Scotland, or is it SNP in Scotland and Labour south of the border now?
I think the way the Labour Party gets anywhere in Scotland is it takes a much less sort of hardline position on the issue of independence, which means in this case going for at least something that Gordon Brown talked about during the independence referendum, which is radical federalism, which is say we have much more devolution, we have much more power to the separate parts of the country, and that is a position that we're now fighting on.
Ash, Deep Titanic asks, can we nuke the home counties?
No, because I actually went to the home counties and it was quite pretty. So there's stretch between oh my god, where is it? It's just in Devon. This stretch where the railway's right up against the sea.
Home counties page.
It's a home county.
Home counties has to touch London.
Does it?
Doesn't it? It's like the ring around London.
Yeah, it's the ring around. Yeah,
you're in the southwest. We're not going to nuke the southwest.
Okay, we can nuke the southwest.
That'd be insane.
All right, so we're talking about Kent, Hertfordshire.
Buckinghamshire.
Oh, we can get rid of Buckinghamshire.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say nuke, because that would actually have detrimental effects for North
One
London.
of those little target ones the
Russans
Russens are developing.
Yeah, exactly. Can I step in? These are all Labour targets. This is where Labour wins now.
Okay, right. No, we're keeping them.
They're only targets because they exist and we don't have them yet.
I mean, targets in the sense of for elections, not targets.
All right, we're not going to nuke the home counties. We're not going to nuke any
counties.
of the counties of Britain because all of them are potential subscribers to NavarroMedia.com.
I'm not keen on Croydon.
You guys live everywhere. If you enjoyed tonight's two shows, the first time ever, please go to support.novaramedia.com. Give us your kind donation of 1 hour's wage a month. As ever, like this video, share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter. Keep your comments coming. We love them. I've very much enjoyed this evening. Thank you very much, Ash Sarkar, as ever.
Time.
James Meadway, we're going to get you back on very soon. This was Tisky Sour. This is Novara Media. We'll be back next week, same time.
Thank you, Gary.